In our previous sessions, we've seen that whatever feelings we have about our lives and our world, going back to the same again, there is a world that we all want. A world that God tells us about and promises us in the Bible. A world with no more pain or sickness or death. A world where coronavirus and any other deathly threat will no longer be present. And we've seen glimpses of this new world in the works of Jesus as he went around teaching and healing. But as we think to our lives and our world now, it's clear that we're not there yet, isn't it? This world is far from the good world that God promises. It's broken, and we're the ones that have broken it. We've broken it through turning away from God, the good creator of our world. But is there any hope? Can things ever be fixed? How can God bring about this world that we all want when this world now is broken so badly? Well, our task in this session is to see how God doesn't give up on us, but instead sets about his rescue mission, one that he planned even before the beginning of time. We'll see how the story of Abraham, back in the days of the Old Testament from the Bible, moves God's rescue story along. And we'll see there are three ways in which that happens. The first is that God promises to develop a people who know him. A people who know him. I wonder if you've ever found yourself in a situation where you've been forced to spend time with someone you just find it really hard to get on with. Maybe there's something about their character that irritates you. Or maybe they've done something in the past that's really hurt you. It's hard to be with people like that, isn't it? But when we think about our relationship with God, the Bible shows us that there's one huge problem in God being with us. As we've already seen, the Bible shows us that we're all naturally people who turn away from God and live our lives on our own, in our own ways. It's our sin that has spoiled and damaged God's good world and our relationship with him. So how can a good God be with rebellious people like me and you? How can we have a real, thriving relationship with him? How could we ever be the people who can know God and enjoy being with him if our hearts so naturally turn away from him? Well, wonderfully, God never wanted the story to end with humans rejecting him and spoiling his world and not being able to be with him. That's why, from the earliest days after Adam and Eve had rebelled against God, the Bible begins to show us the wonderful rescue plan that God had launched. His plan to rescue us and change our hearts and turn us around to love and serve him. And in order to achieve this, God focuses in on one man, this man Abraham, and his descendants that follow him. Through this one family, God planned to once again bless all the world. He promised that he'd save and change people who would be his. And it all begins with that one man, Abraham. Now, I don't know if you know what your name means and if it relates to what you're like at all. My name is Mark, and apparently that means warlike. But if you know me at all, you'd know that is very much unlike me. My name doesn't really describe me at all. Rather than boldly running towards conflict, I'd much rather run away from it. But in the Bible, names and their meanings are very important. When a change of name occurs, it signifies and reveals something important about that person. And that's exactly how it was for this man, Abraham. He was first called Abram, a name that means great father. But then God changes his name to Abraham, a name which means father of many. You see, all bound up with that change, God was promising that Abraham's family would be God's new people, a new family, a people too numerous to count, a people so big that they'd number more than the stars in the sky or grains of sand on the seashore, a people who would love God and serve him, and most gloriously of all, would know him. So the first part of God's rescue plan through Abraham was this promise of a people who would know him. That's the first part, but here's the second. God promises to give them a good, safe land. A good, safe land. We've already thought about how this world isn't always good. And it certainly isn't always safe, is it? We've painfully seen that over the last 4 months. We really don't want our world to go through this same experience again. We don't want the same again as what we've had over the last 4 months. But coronavirus isn't the only problem with our world. Global warming is on the increase through our abuse of the world's natural resources. We see vast inequality through the world. In the West, people are dying because they eat too much, whilst elsewhere in the world we see people dying because they don't have enough to eat. But when God spoke to Abraham, he promised a land of blessing. This is the world we all want, a land of abundance and freedom, a land of free-flowing rivers and plentiful fruit, a land of satisfaction. And the Bible describes it as a land of rest. Not the kind of rest we might try and get through a good night's sleep, but true rest. Rest from the pain and the problems of our world now. Rest enjoying God's goodness and a full, restored relationship with him. Rest where all our longings and needs are satisfied by God himself. Rest in a good and restored world. That's what God promises to Abraham and his descendants. So part one of God's rescue plan is the promise of a people that know God, and part two is the promise of a place to live, a land of plenty and satisfaction and security. But here's part three. Part three is all about God making Abraham right with him. You see, God couldn't achieve those first two parts of his rescue plan without this third one. It's obvious, really. A new world that God makes would be fine until people like us were put in it. We already know that the world we have now is not the world we all want. The problems and pain from living in this world remind us of that every day. And as we've seen, the problem isn't out there, it's right here, inside each and every one of us. We always end up spoiling things through our natural desire to turn away from God, our good and loving Creator. And although it's awful to consider, it might be encouraging to know that we're not alone in living like this. You see, Abraham, this very man that God made those wonderful promises to, was also a man like us. A man who also turned away from God and rebelled against him. In fact, straight after God had made these wonderful promises to Abraham, we find Abraham going to the land of Egypt. And when he gets there, he disobeys God and messes up in a very big way. And as a result, rather than bringing blessing to others, which God had promised, he brings a curse. Being around Abraham in those days was very bad for your health. So although Abraham was chosen to bring great rest and blessing to the world, he was still a deeply flawed individual, just like me, just like you. And it all raises a really important question. How on earth is God going to make the kind of world we all want with people like me and you in it? Well, the way that God deals with Abraham answers that question. You see, God doesn't just make promises to Abraham, but he also works in Abraham, works to change him, works to deal with his sin and turn him back to himself. And so, as we work through the story of Abraham, we find something truly remarkable. Partway through his story, we find Abraham trusted God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And that word righteousness is a very important word in the Bible. Put simply, it means being in the right, or more particularly, being in the right with God. It's a word that was often used in the courtroom. So the defendant appears before the judge, the charges are read out, the evidence is heard, and on the basis of evidence, the judge passes the verdict of either guilty or righteous. In Abraham's case, the judge was none other than God himself. But amazingly, through Abraham's trust in God, God passes the verdict that Abraham has become righteous. He's acquitted, not guilty. It means that Abraham walks free and finds himself in good standing with God. In that simple act of faith or trust, the promises of God begin to come true. And as Abraham's life developed, he was changed more and more in response to God's verdict upon him. It's a fascinating story. But if God is going to create the world that we all want, he's got to do that same work in us too. He also needs to make us right with him. He's got to forgive our sins, whilst also making sure that our wrongdoing is punished. He needs to fix our hearts so that we don't turn back to sin again, but instead go on to love and serve him. It's a work of transformation that doesn't happen overnight, but instead becomes the story of the whole Christian life. A work we can be sure of because God has promised to develop a people who will know him. He's promised a people he will give a great land to, a land of plenty and security. And he's promised a people who are made right with him. All those promises to Abraham start that story of those promises that go all the way to us today as well. In our next session, we'll see how Abraham's descendants had to learn these same lessons, that they also needed to trust in God's promises. And as we do that, we'll also see that despite their sin and their constant rejection of God, it didn't stop God from pursuing his rescue plan. That nothing stops God from bringing about this world that we all want.